So, eminent historian, economist, and one of India's most respected public intellectuals, Dr. Ramachandra Guha is the deeply knowledgeable biographer of Mahatma Gandhi, on whom he has written two heavily researched and eminently readable biographies. Gandhi Before India in 2013, its sequel, Gandhi Years That Changed the World, 1914 to 48 in 2018. Prior to that, he wrote the most authoritative and readable history of post-independence India, titled India After Gandhi in 2007. Other works include Patriots and Partisans, 2012, Democrats and Dissenters, 2016. All treasure troves of information and highly readable biographies of India's social reformers and freedom fighters. An alumnus of the Blue Doon School, St. Stephen's College in IIM, Calcutta, from where he was awarded his doctorate, with his thesis being the Chipko movement, this environment, saving the trees, Chipko movement. Dr. Guha has a wide range of interests. In his prolific career, he has written highly appreciated books on environmentalism, and the game of cricket, of which he's an aficionado. Moreover, he's a regular, plain-spoken columnist with the Hindustan Times, Delhi, Telegraph, Kolkata, and several news magazines, including Caravan and Outlook. Dr. Guha, thank you very much for making the time to speak to the 1 million readers plus of Education World. So I'll go straight into the first question. Given the two detailed biographies and several other books centered around Mahatma Gandhi, you evidently believe he was an extraordinary individual, a brilliant strategist who shaped and led India's unique freedom movement, and an individual of utmost personal integrity and the leader who united India. But after independence, his teachings and vision were quickly forgotten. Do you agree?
So I'll come to that, Dilip, but about whether his vision was honored or dishonored or both. But first of all, I want to say that Gandhi fascinates me as a historian and as a biographer. I'm not a Gandhian, nor am I an unqualified admirer of Gandhi. I think Gandhi is significant for the movements he led, for the debates he initiated, for his moral courage, but he was not always right. For example, on the question of caste, Ambedkar was more perceptive than him. On the question of gender equality, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay was arguably more forward than him. On the question of nationalism and internationalism, Tagore had more insightful things to say than Gandhi. But it's the range of his work, his ability to mobilize people, and as I said, his extraordinary moral courage and clarity of thought that makes him interesting. So I would like to just absolutely squarely state at the outset, I'm a student of Gandhi, not a follower of Gandhi. I admire him, but with qualifications, along with other remarkable Indians. So obviously, you asked the question, what of Gandhi remains in India today? Now, to answer that, I'd like to invoke an image used by Gandhi almost 100 years ago in 1922, around the time of the non-cooperation movement. He said in 1922, 100 years ago, he said, when Swaraj comes, Swaraj will be a sturdy bed with 4 robust pillars. And these pillars he called non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, and the promotion of Khadi. Now,
promotion of?
Khadi.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So by these he meant non-violence. So Indians, when freedom comes, Indians must settle their debates non-violently, peaceably. Hindu-Muslim harmony was crucial, of course, to Gandhi's vision of India. Abolition of untouchability, which also would mean abolition of gender discrimination, because Gandhi was also committed to the emancipation of women. And Khadi, you can think of employment generation, ending of poverty, dignity of labor, and so on. Now, obviously, those 4 ideals are still important. Yes. And they still challenge us. We still must honor them. Of those 4, I'd say the one that is under most threat today is Hindu-Muslim harmony. I think majoritarianism has posed a major question mark to Gandhi's vision of India. But there are many other challenges we face. Environmental degradation would be one that Gandhi would deplore. The abusive language on social media, for example, would have appalled Gandhi. Because when Gandhi talked about non-violence, Dilip, he meant non-violence in word and his deed. And in deed, if you look at his own arguments, for example, if you look at his arguments with Ambedkar and Jinnah, Ambedkar and Jinnah were often very harsh and polemical in the language they used about Gandhi. But Gandhi differed with them on ideas and policies, but he never used vituperative language. So non-violence in word, which is violated every single day by virtually everyone, whether it be politicians or Twitterati or or TV anchors. So I think Gandhi would have finally decidedly mixed feelings about India today. He wouldn't be totally disappointed. Dalits have emancipated themselves quite considerably. Women are more visible in public life than they were in his time. The growth of entrepreneurship, particularly among the young, would have pleased him. But there were other aspects of India today that I think he would be deeply disappointed by. And so in that sense, you and me as well.
Yes, including physical violence also, because there are lots of riots, and as you say, Hindu-Muslim clashes, lynchings.
Also on the question of violence, for example, if you take the case of Kashmir.
Yes.
Now, I have studied the problem of Kashmir very seriously, and my book, India After Gandhi, has more than 100 pages on Kashmir, and I've continued to study it. I've visited the valley many times. And my view is that the Indian government, not just the current government, but from Nehru's government onward, successive Indian governments have suppressed the Kashmiris, not given them their rights, violated the constitutional assurances given to them. But in protesting against this discrimination, the Kashmiris have resorted excessively to violence, glorifying jihad. Now, what if the Kashmiris in 1989, instead of launching an armed struggle, had launched a satyagraha for their rights?
Yes.
I think firstly, they're more likely to have succeeded. Secondly, they would have had much more moral strength. Likewise with the Nagas or with the Naxalites. Now, the Naxalites claim that they are fighting for the rights of tribals, and Adivasis are extremely exploited. But why not fight for them non-violently? I mean, that gives you much more credibility than picking up guns and blasting the hell out of your opponents.
Indeed, yes, indeed. So, particularly in recent years, I think you covered this, my next question, particularly in recent years, and indeed the practice of communal harmony, upliftment of Dalit community seem to have been forgotten. So I think you answered that. So the next question I'll go to, Ram, is you're also an admirer, self-confessed admirer of Jawaharlal Nehru, independent India's first prime minister. But in recent years, there's been a reassessment of Nehru. He was parachuted into the Congress, as you yourself have detailed, Congress leadership and the freedom movement by his overindulgent father. In the critical year 1946, the AICC election, for the presidency of Congress, which would determine the first prime minister of independent India, Nehru didn't get a single vote, which went overwhelmingly in favor of Sardar Patel. Yet Nehru refused to stand down and threatened to split the party and persuaded Gandhiji to request Patel to withdraw his nomination. Moreover, after independence, Nehru imposed the inorganic Soviet-inspired socialist economic development model on the nation, which led India to socio-economic ruin. What's your comment?
So I think those are extreme statements, both of them. And the first has no basis in fact. In fact, it is an example of twisting the truth. It was not an AICC meeting. It was a meeting of the Congress Working Committee. And, and Alex, this is a very important issue. And WhatsApp University has distorted the question of the Congress presidency in 1946 enormously. So you must hear me out, and I'll explain this patiently. Now, I'll come to Nehru's faults also in a minute, but let me explain first why Nehru was chosen our first prime minister. From the 1930s, Nehru was regarded as next to Gandhi in popularity. When the 1937 elections took place under the Government of India Act and the Congress came to power in 7 out of 9 states, it was largely because of Nehru's campaigning. He was called the Bradman of the Congress. Patel was the backroom boy, brilliant organizer, fantastic strategist, but with no charisma or appeal. Now, so Nehru was also, Gandhi chose Nehru as a successor because he was the least parochial of the younger generation of Congress. Patel was seen as a Gujarati Hindu. Rajagopalachari was a Tamil Brahmin. Nehru was trusted by the Muslims, admired in South India, and totally committed to gender equality. So he was a man who stood for gender equality, a North Indian who could reach out to people like us in the South, and a Hindu trusted by Muslims. And he had an international vision, which no other congressman had. So Gandhi said he must be the leader of the first government of independent India. Now, in 1946, when the question of the presidency came, the provincial secretaries of the Congress, provincial secretaries, voted overwhelmingly for Patel. And this is partly because he was a great organizer and partly because they reported to Patel. However, there were only 12 general secretaries, only I think 8 or 9 voted for Patel. If that vote had been taken to the All India Congress Committee, which was 1,200 people, at least 800 would have voted for Nehru. If that vote had been taken, just hold on a second. If that vote had been taken to the Congress membership, Nehru would have won 90%. So that was not a democratic vote at all. It was a vote of secretaries loyal to Patel, who owed their jobs to Patel. And this is Patel's greatness. Patel recognized this. Patel knew that Nehru was more popular, and he loyally and honorably served under him for the 3.5 years. And one of the extraordinary things about this relationship is that today it is distorted as one of rivals. The Congress promotes Nehru, the BJP promotes Patel, but they worked together, as my book shows, to build a united and democratic India. And it's not just a distortion of history, it's a perversion of a history, and it's an insult to two men who are comrades and colleagues and co-workers, to pit them against one another. That's about Nehru and Patel.
Let me just interrupt you for a minute, but wasn't that the traditional way in which the president of the Congress was chosen?
Yes.
Year 1930 onwards.
But this was a critical year. The person who was president would become prime minister. Gandhi recognized this. And Gandhi knew that Nehru was in all ways, and Patel himself knew that Nehru was in all ways more suited. In fact, if your readers were to go through Rajmohan Gandhi's biography of Patel, they'll see that Patel himself clearly says, there's a famous account of a public meeting, and large crowds have come, and the American journalist Vincent Chin is there, and Patel says they've come to hear Jawaharlal, not me. And of course, Nehru was also much younger than Patel, and Gandhi knew that. So I think it's an absolute insult to the memory of Nehru and Patel to posthumously set themselves as rivals. They had disagreements, but they worked together. And Patel himself was had enormous admiration for Nehru. I mean, if you see what they wrote about each other in public and in private. So I think this is a very, it's a distortion of history, which is pernicious, wrong, and poisonous to our public discourse, and most of all, is extremely insulting to the memory of Nehru and Patel. Now, coming to Nehru himself, he had enormous achievements and enormous failures. Now, contrary to those who think that the Soviet model of economics was his greatest failure, I think his greatest failure, and since this is relevant to your magazine, Dilip, let me come to his achievements first. So Nehru united the country, North and South, Hindu and Muslim, men and women, India and the world. He healed a country wounded by partition. Now, he built a modern state, multi-party democracy, modern institutions like the IIT. Those are all his great achievements. His great failure is, in my view, is not economics, because even the industrialists, as you know, Dilip, in the 1940s wanted state control. The Bombay Plan of 1946 wanted a mixed economy with state control. His great failure was not giving enough emphasis to primary education. He was enchanted by modern science, Homi Bhabha, and all of that, atomic research, but he did not recognize that a true democracy, the first priority for a true democracy would be to remove illiteracy. And I think that, and in retrospect, even today, we are paying for that failure of Nehru. So Nehru made failures, but not the ones that I usually ascribe to him. The second failure of Nehru, and then I'll stop. In my view, the second failure of Nehru was, as long as Patel was and Rajaji were with him, he was a fantastic prime minister. When Patel died in 1950 and Rajagopalachari left the cabinet to become Chief Minister of Madras, he did not have equals with him. He became right on top and he became somewhat distant and arrogant. And he began to see himself as indispensable. And he stayed on too long. In 1957, after 10 years as Prime Minister, he should have left. I think that's a question that will face Narendra Modi in a few years' time. Do you consider yourself indispensable? Before you started Education World, Dilip, you were a pioneering business journalist as the founder of businesses. And corporate icons think they're indispensable. Varghese Kurian never retired. Ratan Tata stayed on too long. So I think Nehru had this. His two great failures were the lack of emphasis on primary education and the kind of fantasy that he was indispensable to the government. But set against those two failures are some absolutely remarkable achievements. He was in many ways the person who united India after the wounds of partition, and that is what we must be grateful.
Okay. My next question is, you've dwelt a bit. I think when you said that the Bombay Plan in 1944 had the cooperation of industry leaders, but I think, according to me, there was a bit of arm twisting and moral pressure exerted on them. The point, I'm sure you'll agree, that immediately after independence, India's several brilliant businessmen, including G.D. Billard, J.R.D. Tata, Walter Nehru, Sarabhai, Lalbhai, Lala Shriram, among others, who had funded the freedom movement and established heavyweight conglomerates in the teeth of British opposition, were poised to conquer Asia and perhaps European markets. But they were suppressed by Nehruvian license permit quota Raj, which favored the promotion of huge public sector enterprises. These perpetually loss-making PSE, public sector enterprises, siphoned away national savings, particularly out of what you just said. They didn't leave enough for education and health. So what's your comment on that?
Well, you see, if you look at the Bombay Plan, 1946, not 1944, it clearly says we need a mixed economy. And that was true. That was because that was the received economic wisdom of the time. Countries like Japan and Germany, not just the Soviet Union, but countries like Japan and Germany, and there was a so-called infant industry argument. When you're starting out the industrialization process, you need state support. Much later, even Taiwan and South Korea adopted that. You liberalized later. And I think in the 1940s, when the first planning commission was set up, there were 24 economists consulted about the 5-year plan, all approved except one, B.R. Shenoy. Now, so there was a consensus that you needed a mixed economy. By the late 1950s, which is when Rajaji left the Congress, started the Swatantra Party, and coined the phrase that you just quoted, license permit quota Raj, I think we should have begun opening up. But even here, the greater villain by far is Indira Gandhi, who further nationalized in the late 60s, when it was very, very clear, when it was clear to everyone. And the economic consensus shifted. People like Jagdish Bhagwati and T.N. Srinivasan and Padma Desai had clearly argued for an outward-looking economic policy with trade liberalization. They had said we need not be pessimistic about exports. So, those were failures of his time. The consensus was in favor of a mixed economy. And people like Rajaji and B.R. Shenoy were visionaries going against the grain. And so I still think that primary education, more than economics, was his great failure. But again, if Rajaji had been in the cabinet, I think a greater failure was to know how to work with people. Nehru, the longer he became prime minister, the more elections he won, the more he regarded himself not just as indispensable, but as all-knowing. So I think there's a difference between the first part of his prime ministership, the first 7 or 8 years, where he united India, built a democratic template, made us respected in the world, and the later part when he started drifting, not just on economics, but on China and other such things as well.
Yes.
So there's a lesson. It is a lesson in that for, I think, every leader. How long do you stay? Again, if I may give one last example, Dilip, from the realm of cricket, Sachin Tendulkar stayed on too long. Roger Federer. Those of your readers who saw Roger Federer's last match at Wimbledon and how he was humiliated by a rather ordinary Polish player, I think there's a lesson in Nehru's career for every successful profession. Don't
Indeed.
take your success for granted. Don't take your leadership for granted.
Yes, indeed. But never, I'm still on the subject of Nehru. Parachuted, if you remember that Jawaharlal Nehru succeeded Motilal Nehru as the president of the Congress, if I'm correct.
Correct.
Parachuted into the leadership into the Congress party at a very young age. And he repeated this precedent by engineering the appointment of his daughter Indira Gandhi as president of the party.
That's totally false. That's totally false. She was president of the Congress, but then she went into private life, and Nehru had no desire or indeed hope that she would ever become prime minister.
Is that right?
Yes.
She became president and then she retreated after that.
Absolutely. And in 1964, so she became president for a year and then retreated to private life. Nehru then groomed Shastri as his successor.
Yes.
And in February 1964, a few months before Nehru died, Indira Gandhi wanted to move to London because both her children were in London.
Yes.
Okay. So there's a lot of fake news, misinformation, both about Nehru and Patel and about Nehru and Indira. I think and you see, Dilip, part of the problem is, if I may indulge myself and quote a statement of the great sociologist Andre Bete.
Yes.
Andre Bete says that the story of Nehru is the reversal of the biblical injunction. In the Bible, it is said, the sins of the father shall be visited on 7 successive generations. In the case of Nehru, the sins of 7 successive generations are retrospectively visited on him. All the sins of Indira Gandhi and of Rajiv Gandhi and the incompetence of Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi and now Priyanka Gandhi are attributed to Nehru. And that's why I believe that it's only when all these Gandhis go and retire that we will be able to objectively assess the contributions that Nehru made to our country. I mean, Nehru, I can tell you something, having studied Nehru for so long.
Yes, absolutely right.
Nehru would have been appalled that Rahul and Sonia Gandhi are running the Congress.
But would he have been appalled if Indira Gandhi succeeded him?
Of course he would. It's very clear. Yes. Frank Moraes writes about this. That he had no intention. He loved his daughter, but he clearly in 1963, he bought Shastri in the cabinet because he wanted Shastri to succeed him. Tragically, Shastri died after a year and a half. If Shastri had lived a few more years, the history of India would have been very different.
So, am I right in understanding that your disapproval is mainly of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty after Nehru?
Yes, absolutely. And even with Nehru, as a historian, like with Gandhi, I recognize his colossal achievements and his substantial failures as well. Both.
But the Indira Nehru dynasty actually planted further the seeds of socialism, which corrupted and destroyed the countries of institutions of governance. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And in fact, I wrote in a column recently that Jawaharlal, I wrote in a column that Narendra Modi is Indira Gandhi on steroids. Okay. And I'd like to explain this. With regard to institutions, which you mentioned, when Nehru was prime minister and when Shastri was prime minister, there was no attempt to appoint pliant Supreme Court justices, to have income tax harass your political opponents, to put governors who would do your job and dislodge opposition state governments. Indira Gandhi started it, and out built a cult of personality, which Indira Gandhi started. Indira is India, and now Modi is Modi. He names cricket stadiums after himself. So he is Indira Gandhi on steroids. That's a good way of seeing Narendra Modi with regard to the destruction of institutions. What Indira Gandhi started, he has furthered in a much more systematic and ruthless way.
So anyway, to come back to the Nehru,
also the attacks in the press started with Indira Gandhi, and of course he's taken it further, as you would know, as a former journalist. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, yes. But the Nehruvian economic development model, which I'm not, in my opinion, never generated the surpluses required for investment in public, especially primary education, as you said,
yes,
and in health. To what extent do you agree this is as in fact you have agreed, this is the prime cause of the pervasive poverty and underdevelopment of India, harshly exposed during the current pandemic crisis.
Yeah, it's certainly one important cause. But Dilip, Nehru has been dead almost 60 years. How long can we keep on blaming him for our weaknesses? So it was a speech, but I think Shastri, Indira Gandhi, Vajpayee, Morarji, Nehru was prime minister for 17 years. We are now in our 75th year, right? 58 years after Nehru, other people were prime ministers. So I think, this is an Indian disease. We always want to blame somebody else. We don't acknowledge responsibility, right? So, of course, it was a failure. It was a blind spot. But why didn't successive prime ministers correct it? And of course, there could be larger reasons. Some people argue that it's a caste question. We are upper caste males don't want Dalits and women to be educated. So if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, long after Nehru died, if you look at the last 20 years, one of the most disturbing and depressing aspects of Indian economic and social history in the last 20 years is the withdrawal of women from the workforce.
Indeed. Female labor.
Hindu women and Muslim women, and I think that shows that we are becoming increasingly a conservative patriarchal society. Whereas Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar wanted us to be a fully equal society where women would play be as important as men. And I think that's, for example, an area in which we are really falling behind China. Gender equality, women in positions of economic authority. You may have the odd Mamata Banerjee as chief minister, but that's an aberration. Broadly speaking, women are becoming less and less visible. An odd Kiran Mazumdar as a successful entrepreneur. But we are becoming even more of a male-dominated society than we were 30 or 40 years ago. And I think that's really where we are going backwards. And I think that should deeply, deeply worry us.
And you connect that with the sort of stagnant investment. In fact, reducing investment in primary education and K-12.
I connect it with social factors, conservatism, religious fundamentalism. Islamic fundamentalists don't want women to be in the workforce. The RSS always wants women to be second class. So outward-looking, progressive, liberal ideals which animated the Indian Constitution. Which people like Ambedkar, for example, Ambedkar was one of the great builders of modern India, was a strong proponent of gender equality. Right. So I think we are becoming more and more, we are becoming, what we really need, Dilip, is free market economics, but social reform, social emancipation when it comes to caste and women. Right. Both must go together. Now, you can't have one without the other because you must create a level playing field where everyone has the equal opportunity. It's not only English-speaking people who can become entrepreneurs. And I think gender equality, I think one trick missed by Sonia Gandhi was that she did, when the UPA was in power for 10 years, from 2004 to 2014, she had a good idea, but she didn't have the guts to implement it, which was the Women's Reservation Bill.
Yes.
If you had 33% of every MP being female, the example it would have set all across the board, would have been astounding. Now, she had the idea, but she didn't have the courage or the wisdom to implement it. And of course, the BJP is not interested in it at all, right? So I think I see this, and the older I get, when I was young, I took men's superiority for granted because that's how it was in my house. The older I get, with a daughter, independent-minded, brilliant, argumentative daughter in my house, constantly challenging my patriarchy, seeing the world around me, seeing everywhere, for example, what's happening in both Muslim society and Hindu society, women retreating into the family space, I think, and then comparing ourselves with China or Vietnam or even Bangladesh. Bangladesh is far ahead of us when it comes to female participation in the workforce. I think this is an absolutely critical issue that we have to face, and no political party faces it. They want to avoid.
So therefore, in the light of what you just said, to what extent do you agree that quality education for all is the magic bullet for realizing all that?
But you see, again, you're right, Dilip. But you see,
Yeah.
it can't be the responsibility of the state alone. Society has to agree. Society has to encourage. They shouldn't say we won't send women. Young girls can't go to school, or they'll go to 10th standard, then we withdraw them. They can't go to college, or they'll go to college, but after college they'll get married and they won't be allowed to be men in the workforce. So it is as much a social problem as a policy issue. For example, one of the chief ministers who was invested in female education was Nitish Kumar, and he said free cycles for girls who want to go to college, right? But
Yes.
the Bihari society was against it because they didn't want their girls to go to college. So I think it has to be bottom up, and that is to return to Gandhi. Why did we Hindus confronted untouchability? Because Gandhi told them it is immoral. You have to fight it in your daily lives. You can't close your temples to Dalits. You can't only marry within your own caste. Now, Gandhi and Ambedkar didn't say the government will take care of it. The Prime Minister, they said we have to recognize there's something deeply flawed in our society. And I think so we need, and once you have social reform, that will manifest itself in progressive laws, in policies, in allocation of public funds. But all this must go on together. So I think that's where, as a society, I feel we are regressing, and we have ourselves to blame as much or more than our politicians.
But it's a vicious circle. An educated person will never want to keep women suppressed, or a well-educated person.
I hope so, but that's not always the case.
Okay, so while on the subject of of economic development, because you're an economist also, in 1978, the GDP of China and India were on a par. In that year, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, as everybody knows, China was firmly set on the capitalist road, as they called it, and gave freedom to its entrepreneurs to promote and manage private enterprise and business in a big way. Today, China's GDP is $16 trillion, and ours is 3. And their per capita income in China, which is now a middle-class society, is 5 multiples of ours. So what's your comment?
So, first of all, Dilip, I'd like to disavow your description of me as an economist. I think you have gone through my CV and you found that I have a degree in economics. But, as you know, you can go through Indian universities and study a subject and learn very little. My PhD is in sociology. And my research is in history. And I have some command over some understanding of society, history, politics. But I don't call myself an economist, and I would like to tell your viewers and your readers that I merely accidentally had a degree in economics. That does not qualify me. I have some rudimentary understanding because of my experience, but not more than that. So that question, and most of your questions, most of my answers have been about society and politics and historical trends. So I am not really qualified to really answer why China has done so well compared to us. But except to say, yes, they corrected. It's very important to correct your mistakes. So, Indira, Nehru nationalized. Indira, instead of freeing up, further nationalized. Now, the great achievement of Deng Xiaoping was to undo Mao's foolish collective farm system. The Chinese Revolution was against landlords. So before all through the 19th century and until China liberated itself in 1949, the countryside was dominated by large landlords who owned thousands and thousands of acres. And when they became independent, when the communists took over in 1949, the first instinct, which was the right one, was to give tenants and cultivators rights over the land they cultivate and extinguish absentee landlordism. In 1954, Mao said, no, we'll have collective farms in the Soviet model. And the state will run collective farms, and you know what happens when the state runs any branch of the economy, right? So 54 to 79, China stagnated because agriculture stagnated. Of course, there were other things like the Great Leap Forward and so on, which devastated them. Deng Xiaoping gave, I think so. It's important to correct your mistakes. Now, again, if I may move away from economics to our current Prime Minister. In 2014, our current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, grew up in the school of the RSS, which believes in Hindu supremacy, which essentially believes this is a Hindu country and Muslims and Christians must salam Hindus and then live peacefully. He, during the election campaign of 2013 and 14, Modi very adroitly and carefully hid his RSS past, and he said, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. He claimed he was for everyone, regardless of religion. Yes. But in the 7 years since then, he has gone back to him. All his policies are essentially majoritarian. He has said nothing about lynching. If you look at Kashmir, CAA, 300 MPs of the BJP and not one Muslim. Now, so what could he have learned from Deng? Deng repudiated Mao's economic policies. Modi could have repudiated the RSS's social policies, and taken India somewhere very, very different. So it's very important for leaders to recognize when their ideology is outdated, when their ideology they've grown up with is counterproductive. So I think it's very, very important for leaders to see the world changing around them and adapt themselves accordingly. And I think Deng's greatness was that he rejected what Mao had done, even though that was the stated policy of the Communist Party. Today, we've turned full circle. We want to blame Nehru for everything. Deng recognized that while Mao's economic policies were deeply flawed, he yet had contributed to socially emancipating the Chinese, giving women equal rights, into ending Western colonialism. So what did he say? He said, Mao 70% right, 30% wrong. Now, so I think if Modi's view was Nehru 70% right, 30% wrong, or even 60% right. So Nehru's emphasis on gender equality, his focus on religious pluralism, his respect for the autonomy of institutions. We need all that. We don't need Nehru's economics. So I think, but we need some aspects of Nehru still to keep us going as a democracy. That was when Deng said Mao 70% right, 30% wrong. That's building. Now Modi said Nehru is wrong about everything, and it's a clean slate, and I will do my own thing without recognizing what achievements had been made. So I think these are kind of important lessons, not to be too ideological, to even learn from your opponents.
And to build on what you achieved in the past.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So now, what, in your opinion, as we go forward after this pandemic era and tremendous disruption that we've gone through the economy, what do you believe should be the top 5 priorities of the government to?
I think, it's hard to say 5, but let me say some. One is totally abandon a majoritarianism.
Correct.
Number 1. Okay. Yes. 2, give up the cult of personality around Modi. Running a government is the work of a team, of a collectivity. Yes. In Modi's, if you learn from Gandhi how he built a team, he had Azad, Patel, Kamala Devi, Nehru, hundreds of people, right? So don't think, you cannot run a government as one person. 3, respect federalism and don't try always and destabilize state governments run by opposition parties. Amit Shah's sole intention has been to win Bengal and win back Maharashtra, right? Now, you can't run a large and complex country with this kind of adversarial attitude towards state governments run by other states. A 4th thing they should do is to, be more understanding towards the neighborhood. Look at one of the greatest failures of the Modi government. We have lost Bangladesh, we have lost Nepal, we have even lost Bhutan. Countries that were sympathetic to us. Lost to China. Lost to China or somewhere, right? So, because of their arrogant, overbearing attitude towards smaller neighbors, thinking that we are great and they are just we can take it. So these are some of the things that I think it may be too late. I think, frankly, Dilip, it is too late for this government to change. They are set in their majoritarianism, in their cult of personality, in their adversarial attitude towards the states. They cannot change, and we will continue to suffer for, and also their protectionism. I mean, talk about economics. It was appalling that we did not join the RCEP. Looking east at certainly the more progressive industrialists wanted us to join, not the cronies who want protection and who want licenses, not the 2 or 3 industrialists close to this government. But broadly, entrepreneurs want an outward looking attitude. And this Atmanirbhar stuff, this refusal to join regional trade agreements that are to our benefit, is also a real step backward. So socially, politically, economically, I think this government has made a series of major blunders, but they cannot walk them back, because among the characteristics of Modi is his arrogance and his pride, his refusal ever to say I was wrong or I will do something differently. So I think we are in for bad times.
Now, on the issue of the Indo-China, the Sino-India border, it's been unsettled for like 70 years. Don't you think now is the time, given what we talked about earlier, their $16 trillion economy and our whatever it takes, we have to perhaps making some concessions,
yes,
settle this matter once and for all, because we can't possibly afford a war with China. What's your comment?
Absolutely. I don't think a war will come. And I think, though of course, China is now going through its own turmoil. I mean, they have a really authoritarian leader who will undo many of Deng's reforms, who's concentrating power in himself. And I think China is probably likely to go through turbulence as well. So I think the Chinese success story may not be continued into the past. Is my understanding, because he's he also is a megalomaniac, insensitive to criticism. Look at what he's doing in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang or in Tibet. It's absolutely brutal and ruthless, and it will have an impact on economic growth too. I mean, these kind of crazy political policies will have a impact on economic growth too.
But it's your opinion that whatever it takes, we should try and avoid a conflict.
I have not studied the border policy that closely. It's a complex issue, and I don't know the language. I don't know Chinese. I mean, so as someone who doesn't, they're better experts in this field who can answer your question.
So now we come to the end of our interview. In the light of, thank you very much for a wide-ranging interview with covering a lot of subjects. Any final comments to make about what we need to do to educate this country? Which is.
I'm not really. I said I'm. Dilip, I should say also that I see myself as a scholar, a writer, an analyst, a commentator, but who stays away from prescription.
Who still
stays away from prescription.
Okay.
Who can? Many of my readers complain rightly that you always tell us what is wrong, but you never tell us how to solve it. All right. Now, solving it requires domain expertise. Again, if I may talk about one of Modi's failures, how to solve federalism means you talk to a lawyer. How to have a better trade policy means you talk to a trade economist. How to conquer the pandemic means you talk to the best biologist in the business. So as a historian, I can analyze what's going on. I can use my knowledge of the past to interpret the present. But I can't tell you, I can't fix the future. That's beyond me. I can just educate my readers into the complexity of what's going on, into the different causes behind, shall we say, economic decline or social conflict, the diversity of the country, the history and how it affects us today. But every individual citizen has to then use their consciousness to think about how to make this a better place. I mean, as a historian, I'm not an oracle, I'm not a soothsayer, I'm not someone who can really help. I can make this a better educated citizenry, more aware through my research. But I'm not a problem solver. I don't think I can prescribe except to say in broad terms, abandon majoritarianism. That's always bad for a country. Look at Pakistan and where Islamic fundamentalism has led them. Have a more inclusive attitude towards religious minorities, promote gender equality, have a healthy balance of powers between the center and the states. These are things that I can, so broad principles rather than very specific policies, which can only come from economists, scientists, lawyers who know the nitty-gritty of policy making, which I don't.
I think you're too modest. If you're such a good scholar of history, I think you know. And that's my last question. Instinctively, are you optimistic about the future of this country?
My son, who's a writer, and also learned a great deal from my family. My wife, my son, and my daughter are in different ways my greatest teachers. I've talked about my daughter and what she's taught me about feminism. My son has a very wise comment about India. He says, things in India are never as bad or never as good as they look.
Yes.
Okay. So, and it's a caution to old people like you and me, who are senior citizens and maybe pessimistic. In 2004-5, we thought we were going to become a superpower. And in Davos, we organized a big show saying we are greater than China and the world is India. Right. Now, clearly, we were not going to become a superpower. And we are not going to go down the tube today. So, I think the thing about India today is that I'm despairing because of many things I see around me. But we have had crises before. The crisis of partition, the crisis of the China war, the crisis of the emergency. This is a difficult time in our history. And if citizens are aware of it, if our leaders are self-critical, if we have a robust opposition, we can come out of this. But it is a difficult time in our history. It's comparable to partition, China war, and the emergency. It's one of the 4 or 5 major crises the country has gone through. That we are living through a crisis today. And the pandemic has intensified. That's all I can say.
Indeed.
But we have come through crisis before, and it's up to our human will and our agency to show a way for all of us out of this crisis.
Dr. Ram Guha, thank you very much for a very stimulating and informative interview. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.